Today our government is announcing further changes to the building and construction sector that will make it easier and more affordable to build homes in New Zealand and to get our economy growing.
So has some common sense arrived at a building site near you? On average takes almost 19 months to get a house built and consented, so come on in, self-certification. Some tradies will be able to sort jobs for themselves.
I'd like to congratulate the current government for taking this first step and making what we deem to be a common sense prevails piece of legislation a priority.
Hailed as a common sense approach by the government, with promises already that new build wait times could be slashed by up to 50%.
There's no doubt that a lot of the bureaucracy and red tape slows us down fairly significantly, and we believe that with this proposed piece of legislation that we can really speed up the process as it stands.
Builders at scale will have life made easier.
But other new proposed building consent rules are akin to kids marking their own homework.
The devil's in the detail, and the oversimplification that's come out might be the issue. I mean, there are lots of really, really good builders out there, and there's some that aren't so good, and I think we still have an issue of a high failure rate of inspections.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and today on The Detail, the government's proposed building consent scheme. It would see councils being partly removed from the building consent process, so qualified tradespeople can forego inspections for low-risk builds through the opt-in self-certification scheme. It'll be open to those with a proven track record, such as companies building scores of near-identical homes. National Minister Mark Mitchell says it just makes sense.
The one thing that we do have to do as a country, we have to look at sensible ways of making it easier and cheaper to build houses. We have world-class tradespeople that can be trusted, and right now some of them are. They can self-certify. So, Chris Penk is working through that in a careful way.
Labor admits the scheme's got potential.
But we also need to, and reasonably, express potential concerns to make sure we get the balance right here. We've got world-class tradespeople in this country, but they've been plagued by cowboys for as long as they've been around, and we can't let that integrity be undermined. And we also can't put homeowners in the sight here because they've already suffered enough through leaky buildings.
There, the two dreaded words, arguably the most feared words in the building industry: leaky buildings.
New Zealand builders and other trades used to be more self-regulated, but that regime was in part blamed for slack practices that led to the leaky homes crisis.
Leaking and rotting houses were first exposed in the 1990s. It took until 2010 before the scale of the crisis was seriously addressed, and the government of the day announced the first leaky homes package.
Around 42,000 homes may be affected across the country. This is on a similar scale to a major natural disaster. In human terms, it adds up to many thousands of damaged lives. Many people and their families are suffering health problems caused by stress or by inhaling foul air from their rotting homes.
New Zealand's leaky building disaster has previously been estimated to have cost between $11 billion and $23 billion, which is appalling, right?
Indeed. The cost was massive, both financially and mentally, and no one wants a repeat. So I spoke to David Clifton, president of the New Zealand Institute of Building Surveyors, about the new proposed scheme, the risks, the fears and the safeguards.
We read the proposal and very quickly latched on to the fact that this is very much focused on simple and small-scale buildings. There isn't a lot of detail in that, and that's one of the key areas that we, as registered building surveyors who have been working for the last 30 years to really remedy the mistakes of the past, we're quite intrigued to say, well, okay, this is something that could be done. Whether it's done today or tomorrow or a year or 5 years' time is another question. But what is a simple building? And I think that definitely needs to be thrashed out. And I think that the criteria of that needs to be very carefully considered. And I think the management of who decides something is a simple building also needs to be really established. So is that council who decide it is a simple building because it's submitted to council, or is that an architect can decide off the bat that that is a simple building?
Why have they actually proposed this scheme? What's been the problem in the building industry?
I think I came to New Zealand in 2007, and since then there's been reasonably regular stories about consent costs and time meaning that the cost of the actual works was almost overcome by the cost of the consent process and the inspection process. Now, look, I personally have some sort of small bits of building work done that the consent can be almost a large chunk of that work. But generally speaking, those are the sort of the very fringes of the building work we do in the industry. Most building work is reasonably substantial. A house is going to cost you $500,000 to build, or potentially $1 million. And so the consent fees really are quite small. But I think there is a perception that the resources that councils have to provide this service in a timely and cost-effective manner is stretched. And I think that perception is where the governments are responding to and saying, well, okay, let's see if we can improve this by getting the best of the business to self-certify.
Some builders believe it could slash sort of new build wait times by up to 50%, which is very impressive when you hear it. But is that realistic under this new scheme?
I think it's tricky to say that. So I think you've got to sort of step back slightly and look at the global group of recommended changes that we're having here. We're trying to weed out the bad apples from the barrel, the bad builders that are causing the sort of potentially a new wave of defects coming through on our new houses. And we can see that with the failure rates that we're getting for inspections that have been undertaken. And I think we have to be careful that, the NZIBS are of the view that education is better than giving somebody a large fine. Certainly deterrents are important, but I think, if we can educate the market and the builders, we might end up in a position where we're failing less, and therefore we're providing builders more skills, and therefore if they're more skilled, they're more productive potentially, and that might be an equally effective way of achieving more productivity. Whether this on its own will provide a much faster scheme, I don't know. I think we've got to look at the detail around it much more carefully before we make those sort of calls.
Because my fear is, David, there are cowboys out there. We've got brilliant tradies, but there are cowboys. And I've spoken to enough tradies, have had to go and patch up really bad work. And and I know that's not a cheap job. How do you protect homeowners from these cowboys who decide, actually, I'm just going to sign this house off myself. We're good to go, or in probably their case, bad to go?
Well, I think, the track record position. If you look back in history in New Zealand, we've had some superb examples of historically in New Zealand building well. You look right back 100 years ago, we were mass building villas. There were modular kit built buildings, and they were just plonking these villas up. And 120 years later, most of them are still heavily refurbished and very expensive these days, but are doing well. We had the 50s with the brick and tiles. I think we are at a position where we've got complicated buildings being built, and some of those buildings are almost at a point where you're putting components together from different materials and suppliers. And if you're not particularly trained on those things and how those components go together, then really it becomes a very difficult process to build well. Weeding the bad apples out is a tricky thing. We're never going to be able to get them all out, but we have to be better at just general building rather than focus on the bad apples as the core issue. General construction can't have failure rates. At the moment, we've got final inspection rates in Auckland where we're failing 37% of the final inspections on building.
Why is that? Is that from the bad apples in there, or is it building materials? What's the issue?
There is just not enough qualified builders. I think that's one of the issues. If we start penalising people, kicking them out of the industry, not educating them and improving their skill sets, then potentially we're going to make housing costs more expensive because you'll have less builders, and that will drive demand to a smaller group of people. So I think this is a very fine balance. I think what we're enjoying seeing in the industry is so many good ideas coming in from government around possible ways forward. And if we can meld them all into one process, then we might get somewhere. But I think weeding bad apples out is always going to occur. It's never going to stop. It's just part of construction. Unfortunately, there are always people who are going to take advantage of a situation. This scheme, however, the one that's being talked about currently, is looking for the upper echelon of group builders and builders who are building high-end buildings and the like. And those people who potentially a building in a smaller zone that have got very good track record. That's where this one's slightly different, where it's focusing on trying to pick the best out of the business and saying, okay, you're trustworthy, you're doing a good job. Still needs auditing, still needs QA, still needs random inspections in our view in terms of what they're doing and making sure that they're being kept on the up and up, if you like.
Well, see, I think that's important because it's sort of effectively giving kids a marker and saying, go on, mark your own homework. And it's human behaviour to cheat just a little bit, or in some cases, a whole lot. Is that a concern that people go, oh, God, that's good enough, just tick it off, it'll survive?
I think if this was open to the whole market, I think you'd possibly be in that scenario where the whole market had the opportunity to self-certify, then it might become a free-for-all. I think with this particular policy, they're quite clear that it's small buildings and simple buildings, and that it's also the people who have got a track record. And again, we need to understand what is the criterion about a track record.
Yeah.
How is it that they look at the failure rate on their last 10 years and say, okay, that's a track record, or is it the last 12 months? Those things make a big difference, because someone can perform well for 12 months and then have a change of staff, lose a really key site manager, and actually lose a really important cog in their process and actually have a dip in performance. So, yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky.
That's really tricky. And say I'm getting my house built, a simple house or a building, and I wanted a council sign-off instead of the builder saying, look, I can do it. Can I request that under this new proposed scheme?
Well, I think there's a drive, obviously, to reduce the workload of the likes of Auckland Council and the other councils around the country that in the main hubs are under lots of pressure to build more and build faster. We would hope that the consumer, who should be centering all of these decisions and these policies, in our view, should be able to make those selections. Now, what we don't understand is how the details going to work, but we would perceive that it wouldn't be the builder who would be choosing that the project is viable for self-certification, but potentially the architect or the consultant team are looking at it going, that hits the criteria as a simple building, therefore it can self-certify. And then maybe that's registered with a local council so that they know the building work is occurring at least. Again, it's the detail we're really keen to see, but it's definitely from our side. It's not a no. It's how does it work?
Hold on, I want a few more details. What in your mind do you think is a simple building?
Well, we'd be certainly considering a fairly low, one-story residential house maybe sits within that, depending on its size. But again, it depends on how many types of cladding it has, what its shape is. Is it a square box or is it a circle? If it's a circle, it's not a simple building. It's going to be really complicated. Is it curved walls or is it straight walls? Is it on a sloped site where they've got lots of retaining walls and structure involved? Or is it actually just a flat site? Those are the sort of discussion points I think would have to be in the criteria somewhere to establish that.
Now, if the builder does stuff it up,
yeah,
will they have to pay for it since they've signed it off? It won't be on the council anymore?
Well, in theory, what they're talking about is having professional indemnity insurance. So as registered builder surveyors under the NZIBS regulations, we all have professional indemnity insurance. So if we're negligent, we stuff up, we make a accidental fault, give the wrong piece of advice, we have insurance that you can claim against and get the issue sorted. And I think the aim of this policy is to drive the construction firms into that same sort of process, that they have an insurance that can back them if they go wrong. That is tricky. Insurance is driven by an international market. It's not driven by a local market. It's internationally stock marketed kind of approach. Risk is something that's getting more expensive. PI insurance has been on the rise for the last 20 years, and we don't see it getting any cheaper, which means if you have every contractor wanting to have a PI insurance, that's a big market you're suddenly going to have to find funding for. And I think that is tricky. I don't think, so the NZIBS do not agree that master builders or certified builders guarantees and warranties will stand up to the level of professional indemnity insurance, which is a third-party cover. we see those sort of guarantees really acting for their members, the master builders, not particularly front and face customer protection. My understanding is that that's what they're going to try and do is get an insurance basis for everybody. I think if they can't get the market to buy into it, which it's difficult, then it may well have to be a government-backed insurance scheme where there's a levy paid into, and much like they do in the UK, there's a levy you pay into when you have a house, and should something go wrong, that levy pays out.
Suddenly getting that much more complicated again. I'm interested because electricians and, say, gas fitters, they already sort of effectively inspect their own work. Has this ever presented any issues that you're aware of?
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned that, because, as I say, at the moment, there are some really interesting statistics coming out of Auckland Council around failure rates.
Auckland Council has told me that while they support the government's aspiration to build more homes, they do have some reservations about pulling back on the number of building inspections, and it's not hard to see why. From the data they've provided me, it shows that the council is currently failing 25 to 35% of all building inspections. That's over 50,000 failed inspections a year in Auckland alone.
Yeah, nearly 300 millimetres out along the length of the building there. That block work has been built out of level. It's quite a big slope. And I've got to ask the question here, how is the bricklayer going to lay his bricks on that?
And we've got a working group around the working remote inspections and bits and pieces, and we've got Auckland Council on that working group, and they've very kindly provided us a series of statistics around the failure rates for different groups of constructors. And there is a stark difference between electricians and gas fitters and general construction. General construction is failing badly.
That wall plate isn't even fixed to the block work anyway, so they're pretty useless.
Electricians' failure rate is around 6 or 7, 8%, something like that. Same with gas fitters, which is really good. That's what we should be seeing in our general construction failure rate. And if we get to that point, then maybe that self-certification is something that we really should be looking at doing, because it means we're building well, we're building consistently. If we can get to that point, then this sort of really makes sense.
Is it a sort of an issue of they step up, they have ownership, and they do the job well because it's all on them?
You'd hope so. I mean, that's how we, as registered and chartered building surveyors, I'm a registered and chartered building surveyor, and we do that. We step up. We have a strong QA process. We have a diligence in what we're doing. We really consider the impact of what we're doing on the consumer. Consumer is really, really at the forefront of our minds day in, day out. And I think that's one of the changes that construction's got to take on board, that the construction stage is to say, okay, well, we are building this for a person, and that person needs to be sure and that they're getting what they paid for.
David, it's interesting, since this news and this proposal was announced, the words I keep hearing are common sense by the government. Is this common sense by the government?
I think it is. I think this is something that should be looked at, and I think this is something that should be considered, but we have to get the foundation blocks right. We have to get our failure rates down. We have to make sure our education process for those coming into the sector is really good. So that's Workforce Development Council. They really are putting a lot of input and work into making sure that there's a clear understanding of what is required from somebody in the sector in terms of education. And then I think that the second part of that education is continued professional development. And that continued professional development, the LBP process at the moment, you get I think it's 28 points that you have to reach, and you can do that by supervising a junior member of staff. That doesn't give you any more technical information. That's just management skills. So we would like to see the CPD requirements for licensed building practitioners, for instance, have a degree of technical training requirement, that they've got to attend conferences or workshops or do some technical reading, do technical courses. So effectively, like we do, we're continually developing our knowledge, continually developing our understanding of compliance and how things perform. And I think if we can do those things right, then this self-certification is something that we definitely could be looking at, but it's going to take time. We're not we don't believe we're at that point where the threshold is met, that we've got low failure rates, good education, good continued development of the people in the sector.
So from your point of view, what are the major or the main risks of this new proposal?
Well, the main risk is reasonably low at this stage, in that it's been subject to what a simple building is and subject to what a good professional contractor is being deemed as, and that it isn't open to the entire market. The risk is fairly contained, but the risk is if this is expanded out, it becomes much like the climate certifiers 20, 30 years ago, which wasn't a great success. And the eye gets taken off the ball, and we end up with another wave of buildings that have got problems.
There are warnings New Zealand could be in for another leaky homes crisis.
One of the biggest victims of the leaky building crisis.
The government insists it won't lead to another leaky homes crisis.
Leaky building is a really good catchphrase, and it's stuck really hard, but I don't believe it represents what we see today in buildings, which is, you come back to that, a lack of common sense is occurring in construction. There are just basic mistakes being made because of a lack of common sense. Even simple things like having steps at the same height, one step after another, so you don't trip on them. That's a very common sense thing. But there are examples out there that that's occurring. So it's wider than just cladding failure. It's more about the grading of the building stock and its quality.
I think what leaky building represents, though, for a lot of people, not only that the actual leaky building, but it was when a law was changed and your eyes off the ball a bit and things were rushed through, and that's what it's more the fallout of something similar. Is that a worry you have, that in 5, 10, 15 years we're going to have issues because of this decision?
Not potentially from this decision per se, because we don't know what this decision really looks like. I think it's too early to make those judgments yet. We haven't had that detail. And I think if the detail and the regimes around this are right, then it may well work, depending on all the factors of, the criterion that they set against it, to make sure that there is a high level of responsibility from the contractors and designers involved, and that there are good quality management processes. I think if it expanded and was implemented quickly, we could end up with problems, yes.
The New Zealand Institute of Building Surveyors was founded 30 years ago, and the leaky building crisis has dominated in that time.
We started off the back of the leaky building piece. That's where we were, but we've moved much farther into the whole life cycle of buildings. And our tagline is a better built environment, and we strongly believe that as well. And I think that's why we welcome the ideas and we welcome the concepts, and we'll give honest feedback to the government or any sector that's wanting to change around construction. Because for the first 20 years of this institute, we've been classed as the doctors of construction, where we would be receiving a failed building and remediating it. So we've seen the dark side of what can happen to a building, but I'm positive in any changes that are happening and really drive towards a better construction process.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to David Clifton. This episode was produced by Alexia Russell and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. I'm Amanda Gillies. Matua.